Welcome to Carbon's DIY Garage. Today we're going to be doing, yet again, some brake work in the garage. This time on this 2015 Dodge Grand Caravan SXT. So it's about 8 years old and has the original rotors on it still. So I'm just going to go ahead and replace the rotors, replace the brake pads, and take you along on that journey. Now I'll show you a few tips along the way, and there's a little bit of uniqueness on both the front and on the rear for these brakes. And I'll just tell you those right now. The front ones, you have to be careful which brake pads you get depending on whether you have single or double piston calipers. For the rear brakes, you have to get a special tool or jerry rig your own, but you can rent this tool from like AutoZone or whatever to be able to push the piston in and also turn it. It's not purely just pushing in with a C-clamp, so there's a little bit of uniqueness there. And I'll show you both of these things as we get into it. Finally, if you hang out at the very end of the video, I am going to put a copper test strip, the brake fluid test strip, into the reservoir and check the fluid, see what those test strips say, whether or not I need to flush the brake fluid or not. I've done a previous video on my Jeep Wrangler, seeing whether or not these strips would actually work, so I want to put it to the test here on the Dodge Grand Caravan as well. So that said, let's get into it. So as I was getting under the van to take a look at the control arm, got underneath the engine, underneath the oil pan, looked up, and this is what I see, a wet mess. Obviously oil leaking, and if you look up past the oil pan, it's actually leaking. There's some oil up there, kind of midway up. So I got to look into that some more in the future. Hopefully it's not the oil cooler, the oil filter, the oil cooler, but that's usually what happens on the 3.6s, so that might be a future video as well. Always do your inspections, people. Take a look at everything while you have the wheels and tires off, when you got it up in the air, that sort of thing. So before you start the brake work, the first thing you want to do is come up to your fluid reservoir and loosen the top. You can take it off, but I'd recommend just leaving it in place to keep dirt from falling in. So clean the top off, loosen it up, and also check the fluid level in your reservoir. So if you just look at the side of the bottle, it looks from here that it's at or above max. So if that were the case, if I push those pistons in when I put in new pads, it's going to push fluid out of the reservoir. But if you look down inside, you can see it's actually stained on the side of the bottle, and the fluid level is lower. Even looking at the neck, there's some stains there on the neck, but the actual fluid level is lower. So really the best thing to do, unless it's obvious that it's going to overflow, do one set of brakes at a time. And as you compress those pistons in, maybe even stop halfway through and see if fluid is getting ready to come out of the reservoir. Then you definitely want to take some out so you don't get that fluid all over the place. But just do it slow, check your reservoir often, and we should be good to go. So I've got that loosened up, put the cap back on, just set it down, and we'll get started on the brakes. So we'll go ahead and get started on the front, and the big tip or trick on the front is just you have to know if you have single piston or dual piston brakes, because the rotors will be a different size, the brake pads will be a different size. So even without taking the tire off, you can just reach up on the back of the caliper, and if you can feel two bumps like this, then you've got two pistons. And if there's just one bump in the center, that's where the single piston is located. You can use that information to buy the brake parts that you need. And for me, I'll leave a link in the video description, of course, of all the parts that I'm using today and all the materials. But these will be front brake parts that are specific to the dual piston setup. So the first thing we're going to do is take the front caliper off. There are two bolts that use a 13mm socket to get the calipers loose from the caliper bracket. Sometimes the slide bolt will twist with the bolt, the caliper bolt itself, so you might need a pair of pliers to hold the slide bolt in place, or the slide pin, I guess. Or you can just use your fingers. I usually just need to use my fingers. It's not a big deal. But get the two caliper bolts out, and then hang the caliper up by the spring or something else like that, so that you don't run the risk of the caliper dropping and hanging by the brake hose. It's the last thing you want. It'll probably cause a leak, and that's not going to be a fun day. Now that we have the caliper off, we'll take the brake pads off of the caliper bracket. And looking at these, you can see there's a lot of material still left on these. So if it were just brake pads that I thought needed to be replaced, clearly they're not. There's lots of stuff here, but I really want to get the rotors gone. And if you're going to do rotors, may as well do brake pads as well. The trick on these is giving it a bit of a twist as you're pulling it out. And kind of remember how they're coming out, because you're going to need a little technique to get them back in as well. And now with the brake pads out, we're going to take the caliper bracket off. And that's going to use a 13/16 inch socket. And these get torqued down to 125 foot-pounds, so they might need a little bit muscle to get them out as well. Now that we have the bracket off, arguably the hardest part of the job is next, and that's getting this rotor off. In my case, the van is 8 years old and the rotors have never been removed. So I think I know they're rusted on there pretty well probably. And I put some PB Blaster on there already to try to get it loosened up. I'm going to take a hammer and tap between the wheel studs, being careful not to hit the wheel studs, of course, to try to break it free. And I have no plans to reuse this rotor at all, and I definitely want to get it off today. So if I can't get it off pretty quickly, beating it on the front to try to get it loose, I'm just going to skip to hitting it from the backside, which should get it off pretty easily, but you're never going to be able to use that rotor again. So don't beat on the braking surface if you have any intention of reusing the rotors. Now that we've got the rotor off one way or another, we're going to go ahead and work on this hub a little bit to use a wire brush to get the rust off the center part and also the outer rim of it. Use some brake clean to get it nice and clean so that hopefully it's a little bit easier to get off the next time. So now we've got everything basically disassembled, and now we need to work on cleaning things up and getting ready for reassembly. So you can kind of do this in two different orders. You can do everything associated with the bracket first, or do everything with the caliper first. I'm going to show you the caliper first just because honestly that's where I've got the camera set up anyway. Don't forget to go look at your brake fluid reservoir every time you do one of these pistons. Make sure there's enough room in the reservoir for the fluid. You're not going to push a whole bunch back up there, but you're going to push a little bit to make sure there's room for that. And then go check it again after you're done pushing the pistons back. Make sure you haven't runneth over, and clean up your mess if you need to. And then with the caliper, this is a dual piston. You're going to treat a single piston the same way. The rear is different, but if you don't have an emergency brake set up, the pistons will be the same. You're going to take one of the old brake pads, is what I like to use, lay it across both pistons, and use a C-clamp. And you can't really get a C-clamp in there very easily right in the middle. So I do a little bit on one side, move it to the other side, and you're essentially just squeezing both pistons slowly back into the caliper until it doesn't go back any further. You don't want to gung-ho wrench down on it. When it stops turning, your C-clamp stops turning, then you're done. And obviously, as you're doing this, you want to make sure you're pressing only on metal. You're not pressing on any brake lines or anything like that. You might have gotten from AutoZone or someplace else, or have one in your garage, a specific brake caliper tool. Maybe it'll let you depress both pistons at the same time. Obviously, use that. And if you have a single piston, then it's pretty easy. Same method, but just center up your C-clamp and you're good to go. With the caliper reset, I can just set that aside, and now we'll work on the caliper bracket. There are a couple things with the caliper bracket we want to do. There are four they're not they are shims, but they're also sliding metal pieces that the brake pads slide on. They also keep the brake pads in place. I'm just going to call them shims because it's easier to say, but there are four of them. You're going to take assuming your brake pads came with new ones, which they should have, take the old ones off, put the new ones on. I like to do it just one at a time. And I also use a wire brush to clean the surface that these shims sit on, so it's nice and clean and smooth. Do one at a time, that way I know I've got the right one going in the right spot. So this first little bracket is a good example of one where they machined it and whatever, stamped it out, and it's a little bit too tight to fit on the bracket. So I just use a pair of needle nose pliers and pull it out just a little bit, and then just a little bit of a tweak, and then it'll fit right on, no problem. After we get those four bracket shims in place, then we're going to look at the slide pins. These, you just gently pull them out and they'll pop out of the rubber boot. While you're cleaning up the slide pins, you also want to inspect them. Make sure that they don't have any gouges or rough spots or anything like that that'll prevent them from sliding and gliding gently back and forth with the brakes. And then you can gently pull the rubber boot off of the caliper bracket itself. You want to wipe the lubricant off of the slide pin, and then also inspect that rubber boot and make sure that it's not brittle and breaking, it doesn't have any tears. And then you're going to take some silicone brake lubricant, and you're going to put some on that slide pin. I don't like putting it on the end of the pin, and that's just because I saw in a couple of videos where it can mess things up at the bottom of the bore of the caliper. I don't know if that's true or not, but I just avoid doing it anyway. And then I put some grease on the two lips, one on the slide pin, one on the caliper bracket where the rubber boot goes over, to help make sure there's a good seal. And then once you've got that done, then you just put the rubber boot back in place and then slide the slide pin in. Just make sure the rubber boot kind of locks into place on both the caliper bracket and the slide pin. I only do one pin at a time because they are specific to top and bottom. And these actually, one of them has a little rubber piece on the end of the pin. So if you take them both out, just remember where the one with the rubber goes back. But I just do it one at a time. So that way I don't have to worry about keeping track. All right, now everything's ready to go back on the vehicle. First thing we need to do is take a look at our new rotor, make sure it's the same size and everything as the old rotor. So first I set them right next to each other, and they're flat on the ground, and check to make sure that the surfaces, they're the same height. And then I'll put them on with the new one on top of the old one and make sure they're the same diameter. And then I'll flip them over and again make sure that they're the same height. And this tells me that the hat height of the rotor is the same. So those are the three things you want to check. Make sure they're the same. And these are both slotted rotors as well. And I don't know if they all come that way or not for the front, but I made sure to get slotted rotors too. And if you're curious, that's what your rotor looks like when you beat the crap out of it to get it off. So definitely will not be reusing this old rotor. All right, first we're going to put the rotor on backwards and spray some brake cleaner on it and clean off the backside of the rotor. Most of the rotors come with grease or oil on them. We want to get that off from the factory. So I'm going to take the rotor off and set it face down, because I haven't cleaned that side yet. And I'm going to take some red grease and basically coat that hub in grease, not getting any grease on the studs, but not just the flat part, but also the bore, the centerpiece that sticks out a bit. Put some grease on there, so hopefully this prevents the rotor from rusting onto the hub like it was before. Some people use anti-seize instead. I don't have a gallon of anti-seize, but I've also just always used the red grease, and it's worked pretty well. Then we'll go ahead and put the rotor on, clean the front of it, hold it in place with a single lug nut so it doesn't fall off. Next up is to reinstall the caliper bracket with its 2 bolts. And you want to make sure that the bracket goes inside the steering knuckle and obviously goes over top of the rotor. And then once you get it in place, get the bolts tight, then you're going to torque them down to 125 foot-pounds. I've seen it only in one place, and it was Haynes manual actually. It said 150 foot-pounds. Everything else, 125. I think 150 is excessive, so I'm going to go with 125. So here are the old and the new brake pads, and you can see, the front sides, the pad surface is identical, but the backing plates are different because one's for the front, the outboard, and one's for the inboard. And if you didn't have the old ones to look at, you might not know which one goes where, because the little pins and everything on the back are the same, but the squealer is in a different spot. But we have the old ones to look at, and this one has the 2 circles on it. That's where the pistons were, and this has a flats on both sides. So this is the outboard where the caliper was. So the outboard one has the squealer down in this corner, and the piston side, the inboard side, has the squealer on this corner. And so now that we know which of these is which, when we go put them in, we'll get them on the right side. As I go to put the brake pads in, I take some of that red grease as well and put it on the ears of both of the pads so that they can slide more freely inside those brackets. I want to show you with the best view that I can the outboard pad, because it is the easier one to show you, and I'm not sure I'm going to get any good video of the inboard side, but it's going to be pretty much the same. And these pads have an interesting way of doing it, because you have these extra spring features on these shim keeper bracket things that hold the pad from falling out, but also help guide them back away from the rotor when you release the brakes. So it takes a little bit of a twisting motion to get them installed, and you can actually use your finger to pull the front spring away back a little bit to help get the pad in there. And hopefully this view will give you a good idea what you need to do, and then you just replicate that same motion on the inboard side. And if you have it properly installed, you should be able to push in on the rotor and it should spring back a little bit on its own. With both of the pads installed, I'm going to take some more red grease and put it on the pistons and the ears of the caliper that will actually touch the pads. So I'm not putting grease all over the pads, just on the surfaces of the caliper that will touch the pads. And all this is to try to reduce any squealing that might happen when you're using the brakes. And I'm also going to take one last look at the pistons and the caliper, make sure that the rubber boots are nice and smooth, they're not twisted or torn, and there's no leaks or anything like that. With everything in place, the caliper is ready to go. Next thing to do is to install the caliper. So we're going to take it off the hanger, make sure that the brake hose is not twisted or bent in any way, slide the caliper over the bracket. You're probably going to have to squeeze those slide pins in a little bit to let the caliper slide over, and then install your caliper bracket bolts. And then you will torque those to 26 foot-pounds. And with that, our front brakes are done. We can put the tire back on and then go work on the rears. If you're only doing the fronts, then you're done here, but just make sure you double check your steering fluid reservoir, and then pump your brakes a few times to seat those pistons before you start driving it, and then drive real slow. You want to follow the manufacturer's directions for getting those pads broken in, but then also you want to make sure your vehicle is going to stop. If you're here for the long haul, let's go down to the rear, and that portion is nearly identical to this. So my plan is to just do the work and fast forward through most of it so you can see it, but then we'll just stop and we'll talk about the rear piston and how it's different, and then get everything finished up. Just a little bit about the uniqueness of the rear wheels. You do have the emergency brake that's part of the caliper, so we'll talk about that a little bit later. But you are going to use the same 13mm socket on the caliper bolts, but it's only an 18mm socket on the caliper bracket bolts. And when you go reinstall those, you're only torquing it to 75 foot-pounds. And the reason for that is it's just a smaller caliper and a smaller rotor back here. When you take the caliper off, you're going to be able to essentially hang it by the emergency brake cable. You want to make sure you're not stressing out the rubber brake line, but in my case, the emergency brake cable is the shorter of the two, so it kind of holds the caliper in place. The rear also comes with this bracket. I'm not sure exactly what it does, but it goes on here, and you'll need to put it back. And it goes on pretty much only one way, so just don't lose it and you'll be fine. All right, so let's talk about the rear caliper. It needs to get pushed back in, but it has these weird cutouts in it. And that's because the emergency brake also uses the piston here, and it rotates it, screws it basically outwards as the brake pads wear. So what you have to do is you have to push the piston in, but then also turn it clockwise at the same time to reset it for both the parking brake and for the regular brakes. The easiest way to do it is to borrow a tool, rent one from like AutoZone, O'Reilly's, whatever. And there's a special tool you can use for that. I'm going to show you how to use that. But I've seen other people do it with needle nose pliers or other homemade rigs. But surest bet is to just rent the tool. It makes it a lot easier. So there are directions on the AutoZone tool on how to use it, but you're going to find an adapter that fits inside the slots on the caliper. Then you're just going to attach it to this little gizmo, and then this little plate slides down like that, and it just slides over. And then what you're going to do is you're going to back this big screw, this nut off until it hits the back of the caliper, and then you're going to slowly use the C-clamp, this screw, the Acme screw, to rotate the piston. And because you're pushing on the back of the caliper, it's also pushing the piston in. So do maybe a turn or two, and then you're going to tighten this. Actually, it's in the loosened direction, counterclockwise, to back the plate up against the back of the caliper again, and then spin it a couple more times to push the piston in. Do it real slow. It's a little bit repetitive. It takes a second to get used to, but you'll figure it out, and then it's pretty straightforward, and you do it until it's snug. And don't overexert yourself. Just get it till it's all the way back. And then you just have to check a couple things when you're done. Not gonna lie, it does take a minute to kind of get the hang of it and get everything lined up so it'll work. But this is the slot right here where the pins go, and when you're all done and you get the piston pushed all the way back, stop rotating, stop putting pressure into the piston, and just turn the jack screw to get this thing to rotate, because you need the slot here to be in the middle of the window of the caliper, because that's where your brake pad's going to go, and it has a notch, a post on the brake pad that has to slide into that. And if you don't get it all lined up, you're either going to have to take it apart and reset it, or your emergency brake won't work. So all the wheels are done, all the tires are back on, all the tires are on the ground, and before we can go drive this thing, we need to set the pistons and the emergency brake. So we'll do that by starting the van and then giving it a few pumps on the brake pedal until that feels like it's nice and solid, and then we'll do about 10 on and off pumps on the emergency brake, and that'll get the emergency brake on both sides seated as well. Well, that is it for the brake job itself. Looking at the brake fluid reservoir, after it's all said and done, you know, when I pumped all the pistons all the way back, the fluid was pretty much up to the bottom of the neck of the reservoir. But now after setting the pistons, it's back exactly at the level it was at when I first started, which is what I would expect, and it didn't overflow. So that all worked out just like a plan. So that is how to do the front and rear brakes on this Jeep. I wish it was the Jeep, but it's the Dodge Grand Caravan. I did promise you one last thing if you hung around this long. I am going to do a brake fluid test using these test strips and see if I need to change the fluid or not, or at least what the strip says. After putting it in the fluid and then letting it sit for 90 seconds, looks like it's right at the 30 parts per million mark. Don't need to flush it, at least according to these test strips, even though the fluid's been in there for 8 years. So I wasn't planning on doing it anyway, but strip now confirms what I was thinking. I'm still not sure if those strips are reliable or believable or not, but it's always kind of fun to see what they come up with. I hope this video's been useful and helpful. It did take me pretty much all day to do this. I was slow and methodical, learning about doing it for the first time. on each the front and the back, doing the videos. So that's part of the reason, but I would set yourself aside at least a good half day, especially if it's your first time doing it. All the information for the parts and materials that I used will be in the video description, of course. Questions, comments, if you think I did it wrong, if you think I taught you something new, all that stuff, I'd love to engage with you in the comments section, and help me grow the channel if you would. Subscribe or just hit the thumbs up button. But hey, if you made it to the end, I appreciate you. This probably turned out to be a long video, but thanks for watching. Until the next video, you guys take care and have a good one.